The light bar on the loader had been dead since October, so when Curtis Lentz pulled into the quarry yard at 4 in the morning, he ran on memory and the 2 yellow cones his own headlights threw against the gravel. Nan. He knew this place the way a man knows the inside of his own mouth. He knew where the road dipped and held water after rain, where the scale house sat dark until 6, where the old crusher rusted in its pit like something that had died upright. He had caretaken the Vermeer pit off Old Quarry Road for 11 winters, and in 11 winters he had never once needed a reason to feel his hands go cold on the wheel. That morning he felt it before he understood it. The dogs at the Halloran place a half-mile back had not barked when he passed. They always barked. They had barked at his truck every morning for 11 years, 2 of them, a shepherd mix, and something low and loud. And that morning the road past the Halloran fence had been quiet as a held breath. He noted it the way he noted a low tire. A fact filed, not yet a worry. He parked the truck nose out the way he always did, killed the engine, and sat a moment in the tick and cool, while the cab gave up its heat. The clock on the dash read 4:11. Snow had come and gone twice already that month, and left the ground hard and dark, the kind of late November ground that takes a print and holds it. He pulled his gloves on finger by finger. He was 53 years old, and he did not hurry anything anymore. Not because he was slow, but because hurry was how a man lost fingers in a crusher or a foot under a track pattern kept you whole. He had said that to the kid. They sent him in summers, until the kid stopped rolling his eyes and started saying it back. Curtis ran the yard alone in the off-season. The operation shut down for winter and left him to mind it, to keep the pumps from freezing in the sump, to run the generator weekly so the bearings did not seize, to walk the fence line in the Hall Road and make sure no one had cut the chain at the upper gate to dump a couch or a deer carcass on company ground. It was good work for a man who liked the company of his own thinking. His wife, Renata, called it his monastery. She was not wrong. He drove the 40 minutes from town 4 mornings a week, and he liked the drive, and he liked the dark, and he had never in 11 years been afraid of any of it. He had a way of doing the morning that did not vary. Thermos in the cup holder. The steel one Renata had given him the Christmas his knee first went, coffee black and still hot enough to fog the windshield when he cracked the lid. Gloves on the dash, headlamp on the passenger seat, the carpenter pencil behind his right ear where it had ridden since he was an apprentice on a framing crew in his 20s, before the knees and the quarry and the gray. He did the same things in the same order because the order was a kind of safety, and because a man who does the same things in the same order will notice, without trying, the morning one thing is out of place. Renata teased him for it. She said he arranged his life like a tool board. A painted outline for every wrench, so he would know at a glance the moment one went missing. He did not argue. That was exactly what he did, and it had kept him whole 11 winters in a place that took fingers and feet from men who improvised. He clicked on the headlamp and stepped down into the cold. The first thing he did every morning was walk to the sump and check the float on the pump, because if the pump quit, the lower pit filled, and the lower pit filling was a $30,000 problem. He went down the grade with his boots crunching and his breath going out white ahead of him, and he was most of the way to the sump before the silence reached him a second time. That was ordinary. No small sound either, though, no settling of the gravel pile, no far-off dog, no anything. The kind of quiet that has a shape to it. He stood at the sump with his light on the float, and he listened. And the listening gave him nothing, and the nothing was what bothered him. He checked the float. It rode where it should. He noted the time on his watch, 423, and the level in the sump. And he started back up the grade, and that was when his light found the track. It sat in the soft margin where the Hall Road shoulder met the frozen mud, the one strip of ground that stayed workable because the sump seep kept it from setting up like the rest. A single print, pressed deep. Curtis had spent his life reading ground. He had tracked deer since he was 9, and he had read the prints of every animal that walks the northern lower peninsula, and he crouched over this one with his headlamp steady, because the first thing that came to him was that he was reading it wrong. He was not reading it wrong. It was a footprint. It had a heel, and it had toes, 5 of them. And the toes ended in something that had pushed past the toe pad into the mud, 4 narrow channels. The whole impression ran longer than his own boot by a third, and his boot was a 12. He did not name it. There was nothing to name it. He told himself, bear, the way you reach for the nearest shelf, and then he set his own hand flat in the mud beside it for scale, and the rational explanation died before he finished the thought, because a bear's hind print is broad and flat, and this was long and arched, and the toes were too long, and there were only the one print. He looked for the next, and there was no next. He swept the light in a slow arc across the Hall Road and the shoulder and the frozen ruts, and there was nothing. No stride line, no second foot, as though whatever made it had set 1 foot down in the only soft ground in the yard. He crouched there longer than he meant to. His knees told him about it later. He worked the problem, the way he worked every problem, by elimination, because a man who reads ground does not believe a thing until he has killed every other thing it could be. A bear walked on 4 feet and left 4 prints in a line and rolled its weight to the outside of the pad. And this was none of that. A man in a boot left a flat sole and a square heel, and this had toes, real toes, 5 of them, splayed under load the way a bare foot splays in mud, and no man had a foot 11 inches long that walked the back of a fence in November. A moose left a cloven track the size of a coffee can lid, and there was no mistaking it for anything. He went down the list the way he would go down a checklist on a cold engine, item by item, and every item failed, and at the bottom of the list there was nothing left but the print itself, which had not gone anywhere while he reasoned, and which did not care what he had eliminated. The rational explanation was a ladder, and he climbed down every rung of it, and the ground at the bottom was the same ground. And on it, 1 print. He photographed it with his phone, 3 frames, and he hated how the phone flattened it, how on the small screen it could have been a smear, a trick of frost, nothing at all. He laid his tape across it before he stood. 11 inches, heel to the tip of the longest channel. He wrote that on the back of his hand with the carpenter pencil from his coat, 11, because a number was something you could carry into daylight, and a feeling was not. Then he did what he always did. He worked. He ran the generator for its 40 minutes and listened to it run clean. He walked the upper fence and found the chain intact. He topped the diesel in the loader from the yard tank, and he greased 2 Zerks that did not strictly need it because his hands wanted a job. By the time gray light came up over the east wall and turned the pines from black to a wet green gray, the print in the margin had a thin skin of frost on it and looked even less like anything. And Curtis told himself it was a bear after all, a big one. Dawn came up slow over the quarry and proved nothing at all. He drove home at noon and did not tell Renata, because there was nothing to tell that would not sound like less than it was. He came back the next morning, and the print was gone, scuffed out by his own truck, or thaw, or the wind that had come back in the night, and he was almost grateful. A man can carry one strange morning. He cannot carry the worry of waiting for the second. The dogs at the Halloran place barked when he passed, though both of them, the shepherd and the low, loud one, and the ordinary sound of them did more to settle him than anything had the day before. It held for 9 days. 14. He counted them later, the way you count back over a fall once you are on the ground. 9 ordinary mornings, the pump and the fence and the generator and the dark drive and the dogs barking and Renata's coffee waiting in the steel thermos she had given him the Christmas his knee first went. On the 10th morning the dogs were silent again, and Curtis felt the cold come into his hands on the wheel before he was past the Halloran fence. And he understood without wanting to that the first morning had not been the only one. It had been the first. The sump pump was off. Not failed. Off. The breaker in the panel on the scale house wall had been thrown, and a thrown breaker is a human thing, a deliberate thing, a thing with a hand behind it. And Curtis stood in front of the open panel. He reset it. The pump caught and ran. He checked the lower pit and it had only taken an inch, so the breaker had not been off long, a few hours at most, which meant it had been thrown in the dark, in the night when the yard was locked and the chain was on the gate, and he had the only key. He walked the fence then, with the light, the whole perimeter, and he found where it had come over. Not under. The top strand of the upper fence, the one that ran 8 feet along the back where the ground rose, had been pushed down and bent. The galvanized wire kinked in a long flat bow, and on the kink, caught in the barb, a tuft of guard hair, coarse, dark at the tip and pale toward the root. He pulled it free and held it in his palm, and it was longer than any deer hair, longer than any dog he had ever owned, and it had the wiry spring of an animal that lives outside in weather. He had a zip bag in the truck. He put the hair in the zip bag and wrote the date on it with the carpenter pencil, and his hand was steady doing it, and he was proud of that later, the steadiness, because the steadiness was the last thing that felt like his. He called the county that afternoon. He stood in his own kitchen with the bag on the table, and Renata across from him with her arms folded. And he called dispatch and told a patient woman that someone had been on company property overnight, had thrown a breaker, had come over the fence. She asked if anything was stolen. He said no. She asked if there was property damage. He thought about the kinked wire and said some offense minor. She said she could send a deputy to take a report if he wanted, but with no theft and no suspect it would be a report and not much else, and Curtis said that was fine. A report was fine. And he gave the address off Old Quarry Road, and the woman read it back to him. Because nobody from town knew the road past the second bend. He set the phone down, and Renata looked at the bag of hair on the table, and then at him. She had not unfolded her arms. She asked him what he thought it was, and he heard the care she took with the question, the way she left room in it for him to say a coyote, a stray, a man, anything ordinary. He did not take the room. He said he did not know, and that not knowing was the part he did not like. And that was as far as he would go that afternoon, and she let him have the distance, because she had been married to him 30 years and knew that Curtis arrived at things the way water arrives at the bottom of a hill, slow all at once at the end, and could not be hurried there. She put the bag in the drawer, with the twist ties and the spare fuses, where it would not be the first thing Mattie saw, and she made him eat, and neither of them said the other thing, which was that the breaker had a hand behind it. And a hand was a person, and a person on your land in the dark was the kind of trouble a fence and a phone call did not fix. The deputy came the next day, and he was young and polite and cold-looking in the wind, and he walked the fence with Curtis and looked at the kink and said it looked like an animal to him, a bear maybe. They were thick that year with the bad acorn fall. And Curtis showed him the hair in the bag, and the deputy looked at it and said he wasn't a biologist, but the DNR had a tip line if Curtis wanted to call it in. He wrote a report. He gave Curtis a card with a case number on it. He did not throw a breaker, Curtis wanted to say, and did not, because the deputy had already filed it under bear, and a thrown breaker did not fit under bear, and the deputy did not want to take the lid off. That he drove away, and his cruiser kicked dust on the Hall Road, and then the yard was quiet again, and Curtis was alone in it with the bag in his pocket and the card in his other pocket, and the understanding settling now that whatever had been here. He stopped at the Halloran place on the way out. Walt Halloran was 80 if he was a day, and had run a trap line on the ridges above the quarry his whole life, and he was out at his woodpile when Curtis pulled in, splitting rounds with the unhurried economy of a man who had split 10,000 cords and had nothing left to prove to any of them. Curtis did not show him the hair. He asked, the way you ask a thing sideways, whether Walt's dogs had been acting strange. Walt set them all down and looked at him a long moment. He said the dogs had been pulling into the house at night, both of them, scratching at the door to be let in, which they had never done in their lives. They were outside dogs and proud of it. He said something had been moving on the ridge the last few weeks that he did not have a name for. He said it the way an honest man says a thing he cannot account for, flat, without dressing it up. And then he picked them all back up, which was Walt's way of saying he had said all he was going to say. Curtis thanked him and drove home, and the not having a name for it stayed with him worse than a name would have, because Walt Halloran had a name for everything that walked those ridges, and had run out of names. Renata wanted him to stop going. She said it plainly that night across the table that he should call the company and tell them to hire it out, that no piece of gravel pit was worth whatever this was. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had buried both her parents and raised a brother who did not deserve it, and she did not invent fears. So when she said it, Curtis listened, and he told her the truth, which was that if he stopped going, the pump would freeze and the lower pit would fill and the company would lose a season's worth of stone, and that the company would not hire a stranger to walk a fence in the dark on his say-so about a footprint, and that the only thing that had actually happened was a bear and a kinked wire. He believed about half of what he said. She knew which half. The next morning he brought the camera. He had a trail cam from his own deer hunting. A good one, infrared, motion-triggered, and he mounted it on the scale house wall facing the panel because the panel was the thing that had been touched. And he zip-tied it to the conduit at chest height and aimed it down the wall and checked the test shot on the little screen. And the test shot showed the panel and the gravel and the dark beyond it. He felt better with the camera up. The camera was a thing you could do. For 2 nights the camera gave him nothing. Empty frames, triggered by nothing he could see. A moth one night near the lens, the slow brightening of dawn. On the 3rd night it gave him 41 frames between 2:51 and 2:53 in the morning. And Curtis sat in the cab of his truck at 4:15 and scrolled through them with his thumb and his coffee going cold in the cup holder. First frames showed the panel and the wall, the same as always. Then in the 8th frame, there was a shape at the right edge, low, out of focus, too close to the lens to resolve. A darkness with a texture to it that the others did not have. In the next frame it was nearer. In the next, the texture filled 1/3 of the image, and you could see it was hair, guard hair, the same coarse, dark to pale he had pulled off the fence, and in the next frame there was an eye. Not a pair, one, caught at the frame's edge. The infrared, throwing it back flat and pale and round, and the round of it was wrong, set too high, and Curtis stopped scrolling and sat with his thumb on the screen and his heart going in his ears. He made himself go on. He had taught himself years back that the worst thing in the woods is the thing you will not look at straight, that a wounded deer you have to track is found by the man who reads every drop and not by the man who looks away from the blood. And he applied that now to the small, bright screen the way he would have applied it to a blood trail, frame by frame. Because looking away did not make a thing not have happened. The frames after the eye were close and useless, fur and shadow and the white blow of the infrared too near the lens, except the 34th, which showed the panel again with the cover open. The cover he had closed. The cover the thing had opened in the 2 minutes it stood at the wall, and the last 7 frames showed the empty wall again and the open panel and the breaker thrown, and then dawn, hours later. What stayed with him was not the eye, though the eye was bad. It was the timestamp, 2 minutes. The thing had stood at that wall for 2 full minutes, unhurried, with a camera blinking infrared 2 feet from its head, and it had not spooked, and it had not hurried, and it had reached up with something that opened a steel panel cover that took Curtis 2 hands and a grunt to swing on its cold hinge. And then it had thrown a breaker and walked off into the dark on its own time. Nothing he knew did a thing for 2 minutes at a lit wall. Nothing he knew opened a panel. He sat in the cab with the engine running and the heater roaring, and he scrolled back to the frame with the eye and looked at it until the screen went dark on its own, and then he did not turn it back on. He did not show Renata the frames. He told himself it was to spare her, and it was partly that, and it was partly that. He could not yet stand to watch her see it, because Renata, seeing it, would make it real, in a way that even the camera had not. He drove home at noon with the camera's card in his shirt pocket, and he sat in the driveway a while before he went in. Inside, his granddaughter's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, the lopsided horses she made, because Maddie stayed with them 2 days a week while her mother worked the lunch and dinner shifts at the diner on Route 32, and Maddie was 4, and Maddie's nap cot was set up in the spare room off the kitchen. And Curtis stood in his own kitchen and looked at the lopsided horses and felt the cold come up his arms in the warm room. He started staying later. He told Renata it was the pump, that the cold snap meant he had to run the generator longer and check the float twice, and some of that was true. He would finish his work by 10, and then he would sit in the truck with the heater running and the headlights off, and he would watch the yard, the scale house, the back fence, the dark wall of pines. He told himself he was guarding the place. He was learning it. He was learning when the quiet came, which was always between 2 and 3. And he was learning that on the nights the quiet came, the dogs at the Halloran place did not bark in the morning, and on the nights it did not come they did. And he was learning that the thing kept a schedule, that it came and went on something like a route. And the word route in his own head was the worst thing yet, because a route meant a mind, and a mind meant choosing, and he did not let himself follow the thought past that. He kept a notebook on the seat beside him, a water-stained little spiral he had used for grease, intervals, and hour-meter readings, and he wrote in it the way he wrote everything, flat numbers and times and nothing else. Quiet 2:14. Dogs out AM. Quiet 2:31. Dogs out AM. No quiet. Dogs barking AM. He filled 3 pages, and the 3 pages frightened him more than the camera had, because the 3 pages were a pattern, and he had spent his whole life trusting that a pattern was a thing you could get ahead of, a thing you could plan against weather and rust, and this pattern did not feel like a thing he was getting ahead of. It felt like a thing that was getting ahead of him. He read his own handwriting back by the dome light. and understood that he was not the one keeping the record. He was the one being kept. On the 14th night since the breaker, the quiet came at 2:40, and Curtis was awake in the truck to feel it arrive. The yard had been making its small sounds, the generator ticking as it cooled, a far truck on the county road, the settle of the gravel, and then all of it stopped at once, the way a room stops when someone you did not hear come in is standing behind you. He sat very still. He had the truck nose toward the scale house, and the headlights would reach the panel if he hit them. And his hand was on the switch, and he did not hit them, because some part of him older than his thinking knew that you do not turn the light on the thing in the dark, that you are not the one who decides when the light comes on. That turning it on only tells it where you are. The sound came up through the floor of the truck before it reached his ears. He felt it in the seat, in his teeth, a low rumble under something faster. A chattering vibration riding on the base of it, two sounds braided that no single throat he knew could make at once. It came from the direction of the back fence, and it was not loud. That was the thing he carried after. It was not a roar. It was low and close and conversational, a sound made by something that was not trying to frighten anything because it did not need to. And it rolled across the yard, and Curtis felt every animal part of him go flat and still, the part that knows, before the thinking part, which one of you is the hunter. He had heard everything those woods made. He had heard a bull elk bugle a ridge into echoes, and he had heard a bobcat scream like a woman in a well, and he had heard coyotes run a deer down a draw at midnight. And every one of those sounds had a place on a shelf in his head, a name, an animal, a thing you could picture and account for. This had no shelf. The bass of it sat lower than a bear's cough, and the chatter on top of it ran faster than any throat-working air. And the two together did not stack into anything he could name, and his hand stayed off the headlight switch, because the not naming was itself the warning. He did not need to see it to know it was not on any shelf he owned. He did not turn on the light. He sat in the dark, and he listened to the sound move, not toward him, along the back fence, unhurried, and then it was gone the way the quiet had come. All at once, and the yard's small sounds came back one by one, the generator, the far truck, the gravel. He looked at the clock. 2:46. He started the truck and turned on every light he had and drove a slow circuit of the yard, and the beams found nothing, the fence intact, the panel closed, the hall road empty, and at the soft margin, by the sump where it had all started, there was a print again, fresh, 11 inches, 1 foot, no stride, as if to say it had been here and wanted him to know it and did not care to explain how. He sat with that print in his headlights, and he understood the shape of what he was in. It was not coming for the pump. The pump was nothing. It had thrown the breaker the way you knock on a door to see who answers, and he had answered every time, every morning, reliable as weather, and it had learned him the way he had learned it. It knew his route now. It knew his hours. It knew that a man came alone in the dark to this yard 4 mornings a week, and walked the same grade to the same sump, and it had stopped bothering with the fence and the panel because it had found the more interesting thing, which was the man. He told Renata that night. Not all of it. He did not show her the frames or the eye. He told her, though, that he believed someone or something was on the property at night with intent, that the county would not help, that he had decided to stop going in the dark, that he would go at first light from now on and do the pump in daylight and let the rest of the off-season chores wait for the weekends when he could bring a second man. She took his hand across the table, and her hand was cold too, and she said, "Good," and she did not say, "I told you so." And the not saying it was its own kind of mercy. Matty was asleep in the spare room, the dishwasher ran. The lopsided horses watched from the refrigerator door. For a week the daylight plan held, and the daylight gave him nothing. No prints, no kinks, no throne breakers, the yard ordinary and bright and cold under a low sun. And Curtis began to think the change in his own pattern had broken its pattern, that by refusing the dark he had stepped off the route, and he let himself ease a little. The way you ease off a sprained ankle a week in and pay for it. Then on a Thursday Renata called him at the yard at 1 p.m, and her voice was wrong. The diner had called. Matty's mother could not get her, the lunch rush had run long, and a girl had not shown, and could Curtis swing by and bring Matty back to the house, and Renata had a doctor's thing in town she could not move, and it was nothing. It was an ordinary Thursday tangle of who has the child, except that it meant Matty would be at the yard. Curtis stood in the scale house with the phone to his ear, and looked out at the bright ordinary yard, and told himself it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun was up, and nothing came in the daylight. Nothing ever came in the daylight.